Creamer Media's Engineering News and Mining Weekly is interviewing Dr. David Hart of E4 Tech, an energy and sustainability strategy consultancy and part of the ERM group of companies. Hart leads E4 Tech's strategic work on fuel cells and hydrogen. David, to what extent are global corporations positioning themselves to best effect in the development of green hydrogen and fuel cell technology?
It's an interesting question. I think global corporations are trying to understand how to position themselves to best effect. So there is obviously a spectrum of leaders and laggards. There are some very dynamic companies, particularly in Korea, for example, but also in Europe, some even in South Africa, like the Anglos of the world and others. And increasingly countries like China and Australia and parts of Latin America are becoming involved. And what we're seeing is a mix between the traditional energy companies who clearly see this as an opportunity and a threat and are figuring out how it fits into their supply chain. So BPs and Shells, and to some extent the national companies like Saudi Aramco are really getting interested. And of course, on the components, the manufacturing and the other side, again, we have a number of companies who are really engaging strongly. So we see big corporates like Siemens, we see a lot of the Japanese trading houses like Mitsubishi and Sumitomo, but we see a lot of startups as well. And I think we're still trying to figure out exactly where the best positioning is to make money. But I think it's very clear that everybody is suffering either from FOMO, in the fear of missing out, or they are seeing a demand which is being generated not only by geopolitical circumstances, the requirement for net zero, but also because their insurance backers or their board members are saying, well, hang on, we need a net zero strategy that has to include hydrogen. So there's a lot of jostling for position going on, but I think everybody's still trying to understand exactly what the best role is.
And are governments sufficiently acknowledging green hydrogen and fuel cell technology as the only genuine decarbonization in the regulations that they're formulating?
I think probably even as a green hydrogen and fuel cell proponent, I need to acknowledge that there are other decarbonization options. So there's plenty of very good direct electrification and battery options. There are other sustainable fuels, but clearly green hydrogen and fuel cells are a very important part of any future energy system. And again, governments are approaching this in different ways. So I'll pick up, for example, the recent announcements in the United States. So $7 billion being allocated towards green hydrogen and its rollout and manufacturing scale up and clusters and hubs and all sorts of other things. There's an enormous package in the European Union, which also is supporting particularly green, but to some extent what they call blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen from fossil fuels with carbon capture. And we see Japan, Korea have always been behind this. Korea is particularly accelerating their legislation. And I think it's one of the interesting countries to name again, because they're actually putting green hydrogen into a legal framework. Most countries and governments are putting regulatory push behind it, but it doesn't put it into a legal framework as part of an energy strategy. So there is a lot going on. I think if you talk to the corporations and you talk to others in the industry, there's still a bit of grumbling about the sufficiency of the type of regulation that's being put in place. And that is because regulation has typically been designed for a legacy energy system, which is based on fossil fuels and storage and gas networks and all of the things that we know and are familiar with. And it doesn't always fit exactly with a world which is much more about renewable electricity, intermittency, the need for other types of storage, the need for hydrogen as a route, not only for energy, but also for chemicals and for other types of support. So I think there's still work to do in allowing the regulatory frameworks to operate in the best way to support green hydrogen and to support fuel cells. But there's definitely a lot of progress and a lot of interest.
So how do you see then green hydrogen and fuel cells getting its way in as part of this spectrum of activities that are there to decarbonize?
I think the first things we're seeing are the slightly easier to enter markets, and that's things like substitution of fossil hydrogen for green hydrogen in ammonia manufacture. And that's an easy win in some senses because it's a straight swap of a green molecule for arguably a brown or a black molecule. What we are also seeing is a lot of interest in other types of hydrogen transmission and distribution. So turning hydrogen into something like green methanol and using it that way. And that starts to enable things like certain types of fuel cells. You can either reform the methanol, turn it back into hydrogen, put it into higher temperature fuel cells to make those operate. And then we see very large announced projects for the production of green hydrogen, which would go into the energy mix more broadly, but they are only just starting to be built. So I think what we'll see is we will see companies which are facing almost an existential carbon problem. And the steel industry, for example, is one of those where we've already started to see green steel making come in, and green steel making means more direct electricity, but it also means more hydrogen in the mix, because when it comes all the way through, it adds, let's say, a few €100 to the price of an SUV if the SUV was built in green steel versus ordinary steel. So that's a relatively small additional cost contribution, and something that customers are probably willing to pay. And there are very few other ways for the steel industry to decarbonize. So I think we're going to see it coming in a fairly logical way, which is the high cost alternatives first, and then gradually spreading. The only caveat I'd make to that is that there are countries where it actually probably makes sense to go to green hydrogen very early on. And those are countries with low-cost renewables, with very good solar and wind resources, who are still developing their energy infrastructures, or who have not become totally dependent on existing fossil infrastructures, still have some flexibility. And that's really interesting. And that includes probably large proportions of Africa. It includes certainly parts of Latin America, and it includes other places around Southeast Asia. And I think those will be interesting to watch in terms of coming at it from the other direction, which is how much hydrogen can we produce and what can we do with it.
But is its adoption, the adoption of green hydrogen and fuel cells, is it showing sufficient momentum to make a meaningful contribution, or is it just going to sort of drag on and not do what it could for decarbonization?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think let's put it in two frameworks. The pessimistic framework is we're moving too slow. We have an enormous amount to do. We're diverting resources from things that would be more useful, such as energy efficiency. And I think there are a lot of people who are saying, well, hang on, there's all this focus on hydrogen and it won't come fast enough. We can't build the industry quickly enough. On the positive side, I think we're seeing enormous changes in the industry. And by that, I mean the electrolyzer production industry, the fuel cell production industry, but also in the technology becoming more cost effective, becoming easier to manufacture, becoming more available. And the nice thing that we have seen in the past is that all of the forecasts about the rollout of renewables have been wrong, and they've been wrong in the right direction. They've said we will only have X megawatts, and we've ended up with X times 5 megawatts. And that's gone into gigawatts and is ramping very effectively. So I think there is a fast ramp rate that can be achieved, but we're right on the cusp of that at the moment, because we have not got mega projects deployed. We have not got manufacturing that can really churn out electrolyzers and fuel cells. And it will be clear probably in the next 2 or 3 years whether we can really enable those industries to make a difference. So I think to some extent the jury's out. I think there is going to be a major contribution. It will come fast. Whether it's fast enough, so to speak, will depend also on what happens with climate science, with what happens in changes in global climate as we go, because that's a big unknown, is the rapidity of change, which I think we're just starting to see.
And based on current projections of demand for green hydrogen and fuel cells, what volumes of platinum, iridium, and other PGMs will be required along the supply chains?
It's a good question, and one which I haven't prepared in advance, unfortunately. So the platinum clearly goes into certain types of electrolyzers and into certain types of fuel cells, the PEM fuel cells in particular, and the PEM electrolyzers. Iridium likewise goes into the PEM electrolyzers. And there is a fairly large amount of platinum and iridium that is required per electrolyzer at the moment. The order of, I think it's 0.3 grams per kilowatt of platinum, 0.7 grams per kilowatt of iridium. That's off the top of my head. That's stuck in there. So that may or may not be exactly right. And if you just multiply that up by the gigawatts of projections, then there's a significant amount of PGMs that will be required. There is a big discussion going on about the amount of iridium that is available and the amount that is really going to be required in an optimized PEM electrolyzer system. And the sort of consensus view is that can be reduced by at least a sort of 90%, I think. So we would need about 1/10 of the amount of iridium that we do now, which makes it feasible to see large-scale rollout. Specific volumes, I'd have to come back to you on.
And how many jobs can be created globally, in your view, through the introduction of the hydrogen economy?
It's always a tricky question, the jobs question, because very often it's displacing jobs from one industry into another. So I think we are seeing that the renewables industry generally is creating a good number of jobs, which are people who can make a transition, for example, from the traditional fossil energy industry, because some of the skills are transferable. Certainly building big infrastructure like offshore oil rigs and offshore wind farms is very similar. And there is a lot of installation required for things like photovoltaics. So there seems to be a good split. And the reason I mention renewables is because hydrogen works with renewables. In some places, it makes renewables more economic because you can then store electricity that you would otherwise not be able to feed into the grid or not be able to use at the right moment. So it can contribute to the rollout of renewables. Hydrogen technologies across all sorts of different industries. So the automotive industry, for example, there are lots of transferable skills there in high-speed manufacturing and quality control and all sorts of things in terms of making fuel cells, but also in making electrolyzers. And there are automotive companies who are looking very hard at becoming electrolyzer component producers rather than only internal combustion engines or components around that. I think in some countries you will see job creation, in some countries you will see job shift. My view is that the total number of jobs, I mean, it's clearly in the hundreds of thousands in the near term. We've done various analyses on this, but it will all settle out. And I think you need a government to be clever about how it supports job creation, in order to make sure that what it's doing is not simply displacing people who don't want to be displaced and putting them into a situation such as we did with closure of the coal mines in the UK, where they don't have another option. So I think the key here is to make sure that there is hydrogen industry in places where there are resources to be able to match it. But otherwise, if we get the gigawatts that we need, then it's probably millions of jobs. But that's a very fuzzy estimate.
And then getting onto the competitiveness of the green hydrogen and the fuel cells, is it still lagging badly when it comes to conventional fossil fuel energy?
It's lagging, but not badly. And I think the difficulty here again is that we don't have the gigawatt projects yet on stream. And so we don't really know exactly what the cost is. We've got lots of analyses, we've got lots of very interesting projections. The IEA has just released its latest sort of update and review for the year. And the numbers for fossil fuels, if you include carbon capture and sequestration, which you almost certainly will have to, are in the sort of $1 to $3 a kilogram. The numbers for renewables are in the 2 to 5, so they're a little bit higher. But I think in some places they will be down at the 2 and the fossil fuels will be up at the 4. In other places which have very low cost fossil fuels, they will take a while to be competitive. But the trend is very strongly in the right direction. And I think the competitiveness is being seen as achievable and something that has to be achieved by the corporations that you were talking about right at the beginning. So without large amounts of hydrogen, it's very hard to see how we meet any of our climate targets. And therefore, cost structures will effectively adjust around this. And we already see huge volatility in oil and gas prices because of geopolitical effects, because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, because of things that are happening in other parts of the world. And so there is also a strong interest from those who are embedded strongly in the energy industry, which could be big mining companies who have a huge requirement, for example, at the moment for diesel. If the price of diesel goes up dramatically, then they have to do a lot of hedging. They have to completely rebalance their future finances. And something which is nice about hydrogen is that potentially it's much more stable. So you know what the price of renewables is going to be, you know what the cost of hydrogen coming out is going to be. So even if it's a little bit higher, if it's stable, it's quite easy to work with. And that's something that we're seeing more and more in terms of big users, is that they want stability.
And which countries are showing the best momentum, the best leadership, possibly countries that others could emulate in the field of green hydrogen and fuel cells?
So I think there are good examples. I keep mentioning Korea, South Korea, but it is very strongly enabling in this area, which is partly because it has a strong industrial desire to be very good at fuel cells, but also because it's an energy importer and energy security is important, and diversification away from fossil fuels is important. So they have seen a lot of deployment of fuel cell vehicles, for example. They've seen a lot of deployment of stationary fuel cells, some of which are now hydrogen powered. Increasingly, they're hydrogen powered. There are countries like the Netherlands, which maybe doesn't come up as often as it should, but which has very strong supporters of the hydrogen economy within its industrial base. So companies like Shell, like Gasunie and others, and is building quite significant infrastructure around hydrogen production and hydrogen use and conversion to ammonia. Germany has a very strong set of plans in place and very detailed targets and very detailed financing. And they're talking about not only producing hydrogen in Germany and offshore using wind, but also importing it. And here we come to places which are on the export side. So there's a lot of push from the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia has been really quite active, and I think is very keen to see how it can position itself in a future hydrogen world and not just in an oil world. Australia has quite a lot going for it, again on the production side, but also one or two of the big companies. So Fortescue, big metals mining corporation, very interested in diversifying around hydrogen, seeing how it can bring down emissions, but also how it may also profit from the supply chain. And then parts of Latin America. So it's very mixed. I think it's interesting. South Africa has a good position here. It's I think starting to get going. I haven't followed it as closely as I should perhaps over the last 6 months or so, but I know there's a lot happening in the industry. I know there's a lot of interest in renewables, and I think it's something that could be grasped onto even more firmly than it is being pursued at the moment. There's plenty of other countries to look at and say, well, what have they done well? What have they done badly? How can we structure this that in a way that really helps us?
And David, as we get to the end of this interview, are there any other important points that need to be communicated at this stage in the world of greening?
Well, I think probably three things. So one I mentioned briefly is geopolitics. I think the Russia-Ukraine situation clearly has made an enormous impact on how people view energy security, how people view fossil fuels, the need to transition away from what we have now, not only from a climate perspective, but also from a volatility and energy security perspective. So I think that is still playing out, but will have a very positive impact on hydrogen. There's the importance of just making sure that we don't get in the way of hydrogen. So enabling trade. Hydrogen is not really traded globally. It's traded across certain countries within the EU. It's very easy, but shipping hydrogen as an energy carrier from, let's say, Latin America to Europe is not something that's really been done. And at the moment, I think it would depend on the form that it took. So is it being transformed as ammonia? Is it being shipped as ammonia, where there's a very clear existing infrastructure and regulatory framework? Is it being transported as something else? What does that mean in terms of taxation and excise duties? And at the moment, I don't think that's a problem, but we need to make sure that it remains not a problem. And the final thing I'd say is, hydrogen is incredibly important, but coming back to one of your early questions, we need to do everything we can. So energy efficiency, I think, is always going to be the best way to start, because you reduce the amount of energy you need. That way, it's much easier to meet your targets, whether that's with hydrogen or with renewables and batteries or with heat pumps or with whatever it is. So I think we need to make sure that we're starting at the right end of the pipe and doing all we can to improve the situation before we have to move to development of large-scale infrastructure, which always takes time.
That was Creamer Media's Engineering News and Mining Weekly, speaking to Dr. David Hart of E4 Tech.